Since I work for the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, I have to state that the views I will express in this talk do not represent the views of the Federal Trade Commission or any individual commissioner. So I know while I was invited here on some kind of pretext of giving the U.S. view on the issues discussed in the Geradin-Nito piece, which I'll refer to as GN, rather than giving the U.S. view, the best I can do is offer a U.S. view, specifically my own. I'd also like to thank CDs for hosting me and giving me the opportunity to participate in this conference. Overall, this is a very nice paper. It is very well written and organized, and I think it will provide an excellent reference for all stakeholders in Brazil's competition laws as they pertain to vertical restraints by a dominant firm. While there's a lot to think about in the paper, what I will endeavor to do is give you some additional things to think about as you continue to enforce and develop your laws and consider whether to write guidances and what to include in such guidances. The paper begins with an excellent overview of the evolution of economic thinking regarding vertical restraints by a dominant firm. Thus, before the 1950s, vertical relationships between a dominant firm and its customers that restricted the ability of those customers to deal with the dominant firm's rivals were viewed as unambiguously anti-competitive based on a rather underdeveloped concept of monopoly leveraging or foreclosure. These concepts do not appear to have been well developed or thought out or modeled, but the idea here is that the monopolist could somehow leverage its monopoly power in one market into another. As GN note, a group of thinkers in the 1940s and 1950s criticized this monopoly leveraging theory, and there's a tendency to refer to these thinkers as the Chicago School, and indeed many of the thinkers associated with these critiques were faculty at the University of Chicago Law School or its economics department, although certainly not exclusively, including some thinkers even at Harvard. These critiques raised two essential challenges for the view that harm would result from vertical restraints. The first is that you should establish that there is something the monopolist is able to accomplish by placing restraints on his customer's ability to deal with his rivals that he's not already accomplishing. In other words, the one monopoly profit theorem. The second is to explain why customers would enter a relationship that ultimately is supposed to make them worse off. Further, given that these models led to the conclusion that there could not be any customer harm from various vertical restraints, many Chicago School thinkers argued these restraints must be efficiency enhancing. Because of this conclusion, these scholars posited a number of ways in which such vertical restraints could be efficiency enhancing, and the paper provides an excellent description of these efficiencies. As GN pointed out, the next phase in the economic modeling of vertical restraints has shown that the conclusion of the so-called Chicago School that these vertical relationships could never be anti-competitive was rather strong. These models show that by breaking down some of the assumptions of the Chicago School, vertical restraints by a dominant firm can indeed produce anti-competitive results. Nevertheless, as pointed out in the paper, while these models show that these vertical restraints could be anti-competitive, they do not imply that they must be anti-competitive. Many antitrust observers tend to group these models with their more uncertain conclusions regarding the effects of vertical restraints as the post-Chicago School. However, I think this may be a somewhat misleading description. The term post-Chicago may seem to imply that there has been some kind of radical break with the thinking of the so-called Chicago School. I would argue that there might actually be more continuity between these models and the so-called Chicago School, and that the more recent models essentially use many of the propositions of the earlier scholars as a starting point and are merely breaking down some of the assumptions in those models. As I will expand on in a moment, I believe this may be a valuable way to think about vertical restraints as one attempts to apply economic models to actual enforcement or to provide guidance. As I just noted, the paper provides an excellent description of the efficiency rationales for vertical restraints. However, the so-called Chicago School thinkers also put forward a number of other rationales for the existence of these restraints that are more competitively ambiguous. I think the paper might benefit from greater discussion of these rationales. One rationale to which I wish greater attention had been paid is what economists and antitrust practitioners refer to as price discrimination, the charging of different prices to different customers for the same good or service. Thus, a number of models by prominent Chicago School scholars have shown that these vertical restraints can enhance a firm's ability to price discriminate. For example, the paper by Nobel Prize-winning economist George Stigler going back to 1968. One of the classic examples of how vertical restraints can enhance price discrimination was the use of time in the International Business Machines, IBM, tabulation card case. I don't see too much gray hair out there, so maybe not many of you remember that once upon a time, when you wrote a computer program, you wrote each line of code on a separate card, then you had to take your cards down to the card reader and it would read in your program, and then the large computer would chug around your computer program. Well, these were IBM machines, and these were usually punch cards put together by IBM to enter your code. And as a condition of leasing its computational machines, IBM required that its customers also purchase these tabulating cards only from IBM. And if customers were caught using cards from another company, the lease was canceled. And many scholars have posited that the effect of this tie was essentially to charge those that use the system more intensively, that is, those that use more tabulation cards, a higher price for the system. And by charging a higher price for the system, that is the machines and the tabulation cards, IBM could effectively charge a higher price against those high intensity users, i.e. price discriminate against those higher intensity users, and also thereby charge the lower intensity users a lower price. Now, I understand that in the EU there may be some issues with price discrimination that get tied up with issues of the common market, but I would argue that the welfare implications of price discrimination are highly ambiguous. Thus, while economic models tend to show that price discrimination enhances a firm's profits, it may be doing this by making the good available at a lower price, at least to some customers, than would otherwise be the case. For example, in the IBM tabulation card case, IBM may have lowered the price of the leases for its machines in order to sell more tabulation cards to the less intensive users. In general, overall social welfare is higher under price discrimination, and at least some customers benefit from the practice, with the result that overall consumer welfare can either be higher or lower. Personally, given its highly ambiguous welfare effects, I do not believe that price discrimination is a good basis for enforcement action. But I mention it because I believe it has a great deal of explanatory power with regard to many of the vertical relations we see, particularly tying, bundling, as well as conditional rebates. For example, the paper describes the Matic case, I hope I'm saying that correctly, where a large supplier of telephone switchboards was accused of refusing to supply spare parts to independent companies that were interested in providing maintenance services. The case appears to have many parallels with our own Kodak case, where a large manufacturer of photocopiers similarly refused to supply spare parts to independent companies that were providing manufacturing services. Many would argue that what Kodak was trying to do was achieve better price discrimination, although Kodak never raised this as a defense. Prior to my work at the Federal Trade Commission, I worked for a consultancy. One of our clients was a manufacturer of computer printers that was accused of tying ink cartridges to its printers. To my mind, this practice was also clearly about price discrimination against the more intensive users of the equipment, although just like in the Kodak case, the parties were very reluctant to raise it as a defense. But I believe thinking about this possibility and how to deal with it would be a good thing for you in Brazil as you think about how to deal with vertical restraints and whether and how to write guidances. This might help Brazil continue to leapfrog many of the mistakes made by older antitrust regimes. After discussing the evolution of economic thinking, the paper then gives a brief overview of legal practice with respect to these restraints. GN note that the EU has moved away from a per se treatment of such restraints, and that countries like Brazil have been able to leapfrog over this per se period and straight to an effects-based approach. I would argue that the evolution of US law has been slightly different than that of the EU. It is true that given the prominence of the monopoly leveraging theory, for a long time, vertical restraints were treated very harshly in the US, essentially as being illegal per se, as was the case in the EU. Indeed, we were probably harshly treating these relationships when very few countries, including those in the Treaty of Rome, even had competition laws to speak of. Over time, the conclusions of the Chicago School, with its more benign view of vertical restraints, started to influence legal outcomes as well. As GN note, US law follows a common law approach, so the impact of this thinking was not immediate, but rather evolved over a number of years. Eventually, the courts in our system began to take a highly skeptical view of plaintiffs' complaints in such matters. And by plaintiffs, I mean those suing regarding such conduct by a dominant firm, which were usually the dominant firm's competitors, or spurned distributors or spurned retailers, those that wanted to be distributors or retailers for the dominant firm, but were turned away because of the exclusive contract. At this time, the antitrust agencies also cut back on their efforts in these areas. While I think there's been more of a swing back in the EU, I think currently it is still very difficult for these plaintiffs to prevail in private cases in the US, and private enforcement makes up a substantial portion of antitrust enforcement in the United States. While the courts continue to take a skeptical view, the agencies recognize that vertical restraints can, in certain circumstances, harm competition. Indeed, with refinement to thinking on these issues, the agencies have challenged a number of instances of vertical restraints in recent years, as exemplified by the Microsoft, Dentsply, and Intel cases. Nevertheless, while both the US and EU would appear to adhere to a rule of reason standard for evaluating vertical restraints, I think it is fair to say that there is greater willingness in the EU and similar jurisdictions to condemn many of these behaviors than is the case in the United States. This divergence at least partially results, I believe, from a different emphasis on what GN referred to as false positives and false negatives. Thus, the EU would be more concerned with false negatives, incorrectly permitting anti-competitive practices, whereas US practitioners are more concerned with false positives, incorrectly condemning efficient practices. There are several theories regarding the reasons behind this divergence. Many would argue these differences result primarily from the differing natures of the US and European economies, as well as their legal system. Let's consider one argument for why competition authorities should be more concerned with false positives, as put forward by Frank Easterbrook, a prominent scholar strongly associated with the Chicago School. He argues that with a false negative, that is, mistakenly permitting a monopolist practice, that such a false negative is essentially self-correcting, because monopolistic behavior attracts entry. The entry may not occur as quickly as we would like, but he would argue it nevertheless will occur, and therefore the harmful effects of the practice will eventually dissipate. On the other hand, his argument goes, if an efficient practice is banned, then any other firm that uses the condemned practice faces sanctions in the name of stare decisis, or the legal principle of respecting precedents, no matter the benefits. This argument probably carries more weight in the United States than other jurisdictions. I believe it is fair to state that the US economy has historically exhibited more flexibility for supporting new businesses than others. On the other hand, the US antitrust system may change more slowly than others. The European system, which as GN note is largely administrative in nature, can probably take a new direction more easily when new learnings take hold. In the United States, given its common law system, reversing previous precedents is a much slower process. This may be relevant for you in Brazil as you continue to develop your own competition laws and enforcement capabilities. The paper indicates that Brazilian law is more of an administrative system, so there may be more flexibility in terms of revising past practice as new learnings arise, suggesting false positives may not be of too great concern. On the other hand, whether you want to be more aggressive or cautious in bringing enforcement actions against firms may also depend on how flexible you believe the Brazilian economy is in terms of fostering new entry. Brazil has certainly had enviable growth rates in a number of the past few years, which suggests you may have a very dynamic economy, so this may be a very relevant consideration as you weigh the risks of false positives and false negatives. In reviewing the paper, and I don't know much about the case, but how dynamic you think your economy is, to me appeared relevant to a case like the Iguatemi shopping mall case that was referred to. Regarding a policy prescription, I think there are two main issues to address. I don't know where you are in terms of having a guidance, whether you're considering issuing a new guidance and what to put in that guidance. But I think the paper certainly has some very useful recommendations what to put inside such a guidance. I would note that in the United States, there is currently no formal guidance issued by either the United States antitrust agencies, despite the existence of merger guidelines for over 40 years. There have been discussions of issuing such guidances, and one might consider the Section 2 report issued by the Department of Justice in 2008 as a US attempt in that direction. Section 2 refers to our Sherman Act, which is one of our major antitrust statutes, and particularly the one dealing with many forms of dominant firm conduct. However, the Section 2 report was never accepted by the Federal Trade Commission, and it was withdrawn less than a year after its issuance following the change in administration. I think this indicates the kinds of challenges there are in writing guidances in this area when there are divergent views as to when such conduct is unlawful. It is also noteworthy that recently our Supreme Court had the opportunity to review a case involving conditional rebates, the LePage's case, but that both of our federal agencies argued that the court should wait until the state of learning regarding such practices evolved before establishing a precedent. and the court decided not to hear the case, to wait. There are clearly advantages and disadvantages to having guidelines, and I will touch on only a few of those issues here. On the one hand, guidelines can provide certainty for firms regarding the types of conduct that are lawful and those that may be subject to antitrust scrutiny. On the other hand, guidances can lead to an inflexible legal approach that may be inappropriate, especially given the still fluid state of learning regarding vertical restraints. The absence of guidelines does not mean that one cannot provide guidance regarding the treatment of vertical restraints. So a high degree of transparency on actual enforcement actions and investigations can still provide a great deal of information for stakeholders. In terms of being transparent on enforcement actions, I don't only mean being very public on cases where an action was taken, but being transparent in investigations that were ultimately closed can also be very helpful. Further, public conferences on the issue, inviting relevant stakeholders, including academics and business people, something that our Federal Trade Commission is quite active on, can also provide guidance. As I noted above, one reason to be reluctant to issue guidances is the unsettled nature of the theoretical economics literature regarding the impact of these vertical restraints. I would also note that actual empirical economic evidence on the effects of these practices is even more ambiguous, and I will emphasize later, is clearly an area where much more research would be beneficial. A group of FTC economists have summarized much of the existing empirical literature on vertical restraints in a paper in the International Journal of Industrial Organization. And basically they have found that most of the literature indicates that these vertical restraints tend to reduce price or increase output. That is, that they have in effect been pro-competitive. So this also suggests that caution is warranted before you harden your positions on any type of enforcement. Broadly speaking, the paper advocates a two-step process for evaluating vertical restraints. The first part is a foreclosure analysis, in which the court or agency is asked to first establish the presence of significant foreclosure, and then establish that the foreclosure will likely harm consumer welfare. And then the paper advocates that the analysis should then turn to whether there are efficiencies of such a nature that they could offset these potential anti-competitive effects of the foreclosure. I'm somewhat skeptical of how often such a balancing is done in practice. For example, consider the area of exclusive dealing in the United States. Much of our case law in this area has been made by our so-called circuit courts, which are the highest level of appeals court before reaching the Supreme Court. Under this case law, for the most part, when a vertical arrangement passes antitrust muster, when it is permitted, it generally does so on the basis that the foreclosure prong has not been met. I am only aware of one case where a court acknowledged the possibility of anti-competitive foreclosure, but held that the pro-competitive efficiencies outweighed these possible anti-competitive foreclosure effects. Thus, our Fourth Circuit, which has jurisdiction over states roughly in the Middle Atlantic region of the United States, considered an exclusive contract between a hospital and a radiology practice group to provide radiology services to inpatients at the hospital. In holding that the exclusive contract was legal, the court found that even if the exclusive contract, which accounted for as much as 80% of the market for radiology services in the relevant geographic market, represented substantial foreclosure, the pro-competitive benefits justified this exclusive contract. And some of the pro-competitive benefits put forward were quality control, cost control, ensuring the availability of services, and minimizing disruptions from utilizing a number of different providers. I suspect that part of the reason the court held for the plaintiff on this basis in this matter is that it dealt with the healthcare field. In general, antitrust decision makers in the United States have shown more willingness to credit efficiency claims in the healthcare area than other areas, and that is, I think, because the efficiency claims have to do with death and disease rather than just monetary effects. I think in other areas, the courts are going to be much more skeptical, or have been much more skeptical, in terms of this balancing of efficiency claims. While I think the proposed quantitative foreclosure analysis proposed in the paper is a vast improvement over per se treatment of these restrictions, I think at times the various proposed criteria for finding of anti-competitive behavior may be met, but the analysis would still be incomplete. I would argue that it may often be helpful to keep some of the Chicago School challenges in mind, and that doing so can help establish a more complete theory of competitive harm. Specifically, again, one, what is it that the dominant firm is seeking to accomplish that it cannot already accomplish without the restraint? And two, why do customers participate in a scheme that would appear to have an adverse effect on them? As I stated before, there are numerous answers to these challenges, but what I'm arguing is that it is helpful to not lose sight of these challenges in an actual investigation. Indeed, my former boss, Berkeley economist Joe Farrell, certainly no friend of the Chicago School, still refers to the Chicago School challenges as organizing principles. So I think that this is somewhat evidence of the continuity between the so-called Chicago and post-Chicago schools. For example, I'd like to consider the Windows Media Player case, WMP case that the paper describes. In this case, the Commission found that Microsoft infringed Article 102 by tying the WMP with its Windows operating system. This case would appear to meet the quantitative foreclosure test for tying laid out in the paper. Clearly, Windows had a dominant position in operating systems, and clearly the tie foreclosed a significant avenue of distribution. In the absence of significant and compelling efficiencies, the practice would appear to warrant condemnation under this so-called effects-based analysis. However, I am not sure these steps alone demonstrate harm to competition as opposed to harm to competitors. Agreeing as I do that Windows had a dominant position in operating systems, what did it hope to accomplish that it was not already able to accomplish through its virtual monopoly in operating systems? That is the one monopoly profit question. Given that the WMP and the operating system appear to have been consumed in fixed proportions, it appears to be a classic case where its monopoly power could not be extended. Now clearly there are models that show that this need not hold, including that used by the US Department of Justice in its famous Microsoft browser case, and which has been more formalized theoretically by Carlin Waldman and others. And under this theory, as was described by GN, the tied product might be a launching pad for entering the tying product market. Thus, this gives the monopolist a way in which it can increase its long-run profits through time. Alternatively, there's Mike Winston's theory, Professor Winston at Northwestern University, where in his paper, the tying product can be used to organize competition in the tied good market. The classic example here is a resort with a restaurant. So there's a restaurant on the resort, but the restaurant is also open to other tourists on this isolated resort island. And by forcing the guests at the resort to only use the restaurant, the resort monopolist can deny sufficient scale for other restaurants on the island and thereby charge monopoly prices for meals to those tourists not staying at the resort. Now, I don't know if either of these motivations were present for Microsoft in the WMP case and what role they played in the Commission's decision. I only point out that this practice appeared to meet the criterion laid out in the proposed effects-based test without, in my opinion, a full articulation of anti-competitive effects on consumers, at least as concurrently discussed in the paper. Alternatively, one might argue that the WMP constraints resulted in a loss of variety and or innovation in the tied product market, i.e. in the market for music players or media players. Overall, I am still not sure this argument answers the Chicago School challenge. As noted in the GN paper, the one monopoly profit theorem implies that monopolists should want a more competitive complementary market, since this enables him to achieve greater profits on the monopoly good. A more competitive market would certainly include a market with more variety or innovation, so I'm not sure creating a but-for that includes more variety and innovation solves the one monopoly profit challenge and is therefore a complete theory of harm. I'm aware of at least one case in the US where the case was dismissed on the basis of the one monopoly profit theorem. This was EL Consulting Limited versus Doman Industries, a 2006 decision. In this matter, the plaintiff was a distributor of the defendant's lumber products in several northeastern states. When another distributor with which the defendant signed an exclusive dealing contract replaced the plaintiff sued. So here we again have a case of a spurned distributor bringing an antitrust case. Here the second court upheld a lower court's dismissal of the case, holding that the plaintiff failed to demonstrate any harm to competition. The court noted that the defendant's 95% market share meant that any exclusive dealing arrangement provides no monopolistic benefit to the lumber manufacturer that it does not already enjoy and would not continue to enjoy, even if the exclusive distributorship were enjoined. I think that a full consideration of the Chicago challenges would also be beneficial for the standards proposed for the other practices, such as conditional rebates, both single and multi-product. Thus, conditional rebates involve giving customers lower prices, and clearly that is the essence of what the competition laws are meant to protect. Let us first consider a multi-product case. In the case of a multi-product rebate, the consumer pays less than the monopoly price for the tying product in exchange for procuring another competitively supplied good from the monopolist. Assuming the monopolist is not refusing to deal at all with customers that do not purchase the competitive good from it, the customer still has the option of paying the monopoly price on the tying product and procuring the tied product from the competitor. Thus, on a simple level, the customer must be better off if it chooses to procure both goods from monopolists. Similarly, single product conditional rebates operate in the same way. The customer chooses to obtain some portion of its contestable demand for the good from the dominant firm in order to obtain a discount on the non-contestable portion. Since it has the option of paying a monopoly price for the non-contestable portion and procuring the contestable portion from monopolist rivals, it will only accept the dominant firm's conditional rebate if it is better off. Nevertheless, despite the fact that the customer is better off, clearly these situations can violate the suction test or equally efficient competitor test put forward in the paper. In the United States, we call this the ortho test, named after a US court decision that applied this kind of test. Now, clearly there are a number of post-Chicago models that have answered this Chicago School challenge and shown that customers can be made way worse off by these conditional rebates. For example, Barry Nailbuff, among others, has shown that the dominant firm can increase its profits from such an arrangement. Nevertheless, in this model, in the short run, consumers still benefit from the discount, otherwise they would not accept the deal. The customer harm in this group of models comes in the long run when customers may be made worse off as the exit of competitors with difficult re-entry leads to monopolization of formerly competitive markets. The injury of competitors can also dampen incentives to innovate. One might argue this is clearly in line with the implications of the equally efficient competitor test. However, I think it differs in that there is a clear articulation of how consumers can be induced to participate in the scheme. It also clearly indicates that customers are better off in the short run, which a simple application of the ortho test does not necessarily make explicit. Indeed, under this class of models, conditional rebates are similar to a predatory story, where short-run pricing benefits must be weighed against longer-term harms. It's different from a predatory pricing story, however, in that, as Nailbuff showed, the dominant firm can actually increase its profits in the short run, whereas under a traditional predatory story, the firm is actually sacrificing prices in the short run. It is noteworthy that GN advocated a predatory pricing type standard for such cases, because that is exactly what these models suggest is going on in a sense. However, there may be effects in terms, if you try to enforce these conditional rebate cases as predatory matters, there may be effects in terms of how rigorously they're going to be enforced. I would note that I believe that it can be stated fairly, there are very few challenges by any global agency regarding predatory pricing matters. Similarly, there's another class of models, for example, one proposed by 3 economists that were at the time affiliated with the US Department of Justice, that suggests there need not even be a short-run trade-off, and that consumers can be made worse off both in the short run and the long run. This is really Sibley and Reitman's paper, which I think barely anybody can understand, but I had it explained to me by some other people, so I understand it. Although the argument, as I said, is complicated, in their model, the customer is given a choice between paying a very high price for the monopoly good and procuring both goods from monopolists. The consumer purchases the bundle because this is a better choice of the two offered to him, but he is worse off relative to a situation where bundling would not be permitted. The model is highly controversial, not least of which because the monopolist's offer may not be credible. My point here is not to go through these various conditional rebate and bundling models, only to point out that the ortho test, in and of itself, even in the absence of pro-competitive efficiencies, may not be sufficient to establish customer harm. Thus, something of a broader perspective may be needed to avoid false positives. GNN also discussed how counterfactuals can be a useful part of the analysis, and certainly a consideration of possible effects would be very useful, and can be a useful tool for answering the Chicago School challenges, as well as for assuring that what we're doing is protecting competition, not competitors. However, I would argue that caution in applying the counterfactual to consumer or social welfare is advisable. On the one hand, there are issues of measurement. For example, determining that prices would have been lower without some vertical restraint can generally not rely on simple evidence that prices went up after a dominant firm implemented some kind of practice. Such evidence typically requires that anti-competitive effects be isolated from other changes that have been going on in the marketplace around the time that the restraint was implemented. Thus, price may have gone up due to other supply or demand factors that also changed around the same time that the dominant firm decided to implement this practice, and these factors should be controlled for before any finding of effects. Furthermore, price increases in and of themselves are not always indicative of customer harm. Recall that many of the mentioned efficiencies from vertical relations result in either greater dealer or manufacturer effort. In some cases, this increased effort will result in price increases that merely reflect a higher quality product. And this may manifest itself in things such as a more pleasant shopping experience or greater dealer service or things of that nature. Similarly, both foreclosure and possible efficiencies from vertical restraints can both increase a firm's market share. So increases in the market share of the dominant firm and a reduction in share of other firms are not necessarily indicative of foreclosure or consumer harm. I think output effects might be the most unambiguous effects. Thus, if the practices are net anti-competitive, output would go down, and if they are net pro-competitive, output should go up. However, measuring output is still subject to many of the same concerns that output may have changed for reasons unrelated to the practice, and these other factors must be controlled for. It may seem that what I'm advocating by stating that more attention should be paid to Chicago principles is to make it more difficult to bring cases against vertical restraints. This is not my goal. I believe that at times it may be easier to establish harm using such an approach. For example, as noted by GN, the foreclosure approach can be quite difficult to apply. Consider the conditional rebate test. A price-cost test to apply to contestable sales involves estimating three magnitudes that can often only be estimated imprecisely. 1, what does the dominant firm believe are the contestable sales? 2, what is the dominant firm's incremental cost of supplying these sales? And 3, what is the dominant firm's revenue from supplying these sales? Each of these magnitudes is likely to only be estimated very imprecisely. The supplier may not know how much of the sales are actually contestable. Incremental costs can be very difficult to estimate because it can be difficult to estimate the time intervals and volume levels at which some costs become variable. And finally, the financial and non-financial consideration that the supplier offers on the at-risk sales can be very, very difficult to quantify. A recent working paper by two of my colleagues at the FTC, Pat DeGrava and John Simpson, seeks to address the Chicago School challenge of why customers would accept an arrangement that appears to hurt them by applying a post-Chicago model to the Intel case. As part of this paper, they contrast their approach, this post-Chicago approach, with applying the ortho test, which are applying this conditional rebate test. And I think it becomes apparent in the paper that the information requirements needed to apply their model, needed to apply their post-Chicago approach, are considerably less burdensome, less questionable than is actually trying to apply the ortho test or the suction test. Finally, one thing I would like to add, I would like to add one thing the paper might consider more explicitly addressing is the possibility of monopoly creation through vertical restraints as opposed to monopoly preservation. I'm not sure where the paper is coming down on this right now, but it's something Brazil and Brazilian competition enforcers may want to think about. This might be an area where US law and practice is actually more aggressive with respect to dominant firm restraints than in the EU. In the United States, there is an incipiency standard regarding many vertical restraints. It is my understanding that Article 102, which prohibits abuses of dominance, would have much more difficulty attempting to restrain non-dominant firms attempting to obtain a monopoly where none currently exists. The legal standard in the US requires showing the existence of potentially problematic conduct, intent to monopolization, and a dangerous probability of success. While the monopoly maintenance argument analysis focuses on evidence showing the upstream firm's current or potential rivals cannot expand, proving monopolization requires evidence showing that rivals either will shrink or have shrunk because of the upstream firm's conduct. Indeed, monopolization may involve competition for an exclusive. That is, situations in which companies compete to be the sole supplier for a particular distributor. For example, mobile phone manufacturers competing to be the sole or primary supplier to a mobile network provider. This opens up many additional areas for discussion, but suffice it to say, many economic models indicate competition among firms for an exclusive can be among the most intense forms of competition. Thus, this area might involve evaluating a trade-off between intense competition in the short run versus less competitive long run. Now, I'm not saying whether or not Brazil should be involved in this area. Again, I just raised this as a possibility, something where US law reaches that European law may not actually reach. Since this is a research institution, since CDs is a research institution, clearly I should make recommendations for additional research. As I noted above, there currently is very little empirical research on the actual effects of vertical restraints. One thing either CDs or CAGE might wish to foster is what are referred to in the United States as retrospectives and what I believe other jurisdictions refer to as impact evaluations. At the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, we have a fairly extensive program looking at past merger actions, and many of the reports are available on our working paper website. Most of these studies have focused on mergers that were close calls, but that were nevertheless allowed to go through. And most of them focus on the price effects of the merger. Nevertheless, we have looked at other issues, including one study of possible quality effects from a merger in the healthcare area, and another study looking at changes in industry where a merger was blocked. Despite this active program in the merger area, we have not done much in the non-merger area. Clearly, such studies would be difficult, and many of the precautions I mentioned with respect to evaluating effects in a vertical restraints case would apply here, but this appears to be an area of research that's potentially quite rewarding and useful and can make significant contributions to both competition enforcement and the economics literature. So in sum, the GN paper is a very useful, descriptive, and prescriptive reference for Brazilian competition stakeholders. I agree with most of its arguments for an effects-based approach to the analysis of vertical restraints. Whether you want to incorporate its findings into formal guidances or something less formal is something that you should consider based on the nature of both Brazilian competition law, but also on the flexibility of the Brazilian economy. And while I think the proposed effects-based analysis is far superior to per se treatment for vertical restraints, I believe the framework can be further improved at times by careful attention to the Chicago School challenges. I hope I have succeeded in my goal of giving you some additional things to think about as you continue to enforce your laws and consider writing guidances. Thanks.
Bom, infelizmente nós não temos tempo para deixar esse momento de perguntas e respostas, mas a SEDES se compromete a responder todas as perguntas que forem enviadas por e-mail, sedes@sedes.org.br. Nós queremos agradecer ao Caio Mário da Silva Pereira Neto, ao Damien Geradin, ao Sócio, pela participação no painel Defesa da Concorrência.